Ready to start. Just ask people to sit down, we'll get going. Thank you very much for coming along to this event. We're going to be discussing the prospects. Can you hear me now? Am I on? I'm waiting for the guy at the back to tell me I'm connected. All right?
We're good.
Thank you very much for coming along to this event. We're going to be talking about the public debt problem, especially the long-term public debt problem. And we have a distinguished cast of white males to discuss this issue. So
some with hair,
there's
some
no
without.
need for anybody in the audience at the end to get up and say, why are you all white males? I've acknowledged it. It's a shame, but there you are. We're stuck with it. Let me quickly introduce this extraordinarily distinguished panel. I guess I always say that when I'm introducing the panel, but every now and then it happens to be true, and it happens to be true in this case. So I don't need to spend too long on introductions. I'll just move along the line before I kick off the discussion. We'll get to it. Grover Norquist is the president of Americans for Tax Reform, a leader of the American conservative movement. In fact, he's being described, I think, by the Wall Street Journal as the Grand Central Station of American conservatism. So, Grover, you must be feeling right at home here in Aspen.
Absolutely.
Bob Hormats is a distinguished economist, formerly Goldman Sachs, who is now working in the administration in the State Department as a top official on international economic policy. David Stockman is a former OMB director of great renown. I was just reminiscing with David. I was working in Washington for The Economist in 85 and 86. And it seemed to me that all I was writing about at that time was David Stockman. And in fact, I even used to get instructions from head office in London, oh, please not another piece about David Stockman. He wrote a terrific book about deficit politics called The Triumph of Politics, about tax reform and deficit control. And I've been rereading it recently. It's newly topical. I recommend it to you all over again. Before I move on, speaking of books, Grover's got a new book out. I've got to read you the title. It's a killer. Leave Us Alone, Getting the Government's Hands Off Our Money, Our Guns, Our Lives. And he'll be signing it. He'll be signing copies after this right out there, so go get yourself a signed copy. E.J. Dionne is a columnist of renown for the Washington Post. He needs no further introduction. And at the end, David Walker is a former chief government auditor, former comptroller general, now runs the Peterson Foundation, which is a non-profit think tank, I guess you would call it, which is dedicated to educating the public and the political system about fiscal responsibility. And in my view, that is a task that very much needs to be done. I'm going to start by presuming that everyone on the panel agrees that there is a long-term debt problem. I don't want to waste too much time discussing that. I would love to get immediately to policies, to what we do about it. But there is an initial issue of how quickly we turn from the present policy settings to action on the debt. And I wonder if that's where we could start. And I'd like to put a question, or put this issue to each member of this panel, and then we'll try and get a conversation going. I can withdraw and let these guys talk to each other. So let's start with, am I right to suppose that we're all agreed that the long-term debt is a big problem? And if I am, how quickly should we begin to address it? We'll drill down into actual policy proposals later, but let's focus to begin with on the severity of the problem, how seriously we should be taking it, and how soon we need to begin to take action. So maybe we could just move along the line. Grover, you go first.
For the last 10, 20 years, there have been meetings and discussions like this about the long-term spending problem we have, the unfunded liabilities in Medicare and Medicaid, particularly Social Security. And however, you have to add to that we now have a short-term debt overspending problem that's gotten rather dramatic. This Congress added $1 trillion in discretionary spending in 2009. So we used to talk about, oh, discretionary spending doesn't matter, it's the long-term entitlements that are the problem. We now have a problem with discretionary massive spending, the $800 billion in so-called stimulus spending, the $1 trillion they added in discretionary spending, the $350 billion in the second tranche of TARP. So we have a long-term problem that we used to talk about. We've added a short-term problem.
Okay.
An immediate problem. And 20 years ago is when we should have focused on
So it won't wait, I guess, is your answer.
No.
It shouldn't wait. Okay. Bob, what's your...
Yes, first I have a caveat. I'm sort of a ringer on this panel. First of all, being in the State Department, as David Stockman knows, the last thing a State Department official is supposed to do is talk about fiscal policy in this country. Or should, yes, or should. So I was actually asked to participate.
Really, it's just between
Just here,
us,
but it's intimate group. And then you get a call from the Treasury the next day. But my role here was to come on and talk a little about the history of this and what the history tells us. So I'll condense this in about 2 minutes because I did a book called Paying for America's Wars, which goes back till the Revolution. And I think one of the interesting points to bear in mind is that for the most part, the history of American debt accumulation and deficits, for the most part, is a history of America's wars. Because the period of time when we've accumulated a lot of debt and had a lot of deficits built up is in wartime. And therefore, I think it's useful to just take 1 minute to sort of analyze how this is different from the periods of the past. After each war, spending has, by definition, declined very substantially because wartime spending was no longer required. And for the most part, peacetime or domestic spending didn't increase very much, certainly compared to the amount of money spent on the war. The second big difference is that during the wars we fought in this country, except for one, the debt has been financed domestically. The one exception in the past being the Revolution, where we borrowed from France and the Netherlands. This time, the debt is financed very differently because a lot of the financing comes from abroad. The third thing is that if you look in the past, what's happened is as wartime spending has declined substantially, there has been a national consensus on the need to bring the debt down over a period of time. We no longer seem to have that domestic political consensus. After the Revolution, American presidents were required by precedent and their State of the Union speeches to go and explain what they had done to reduce the federal debt that had been accumulated during the war. And this raises 2 points. Why was this a national consensus? It was a national consensus for 2 basic reasons. One, there was a feeling that those who owned the debt, that is to say the people who had lent the money to the government, would have too much leverage over the government. This was sort of the Jefferson-Jackson idea. Too much leverage over the government if the government owed them a lot of money. So it was in the government's interest to avoid that leverage by paying off the debt. And second, there was this issue of national resilience. The notion that if you had a lot of debt after a war and you accumulated that debt and didn't lower the debt, then if there were another national emergency, another war or another set of problems that required spending, the ability of our country to respond would be diminished because of that lack of resiliency. So if you're projecting this to the future, then the question is, over the medium term, in the short and the medium term, particularly the medium term, how do you develop the national consensus that's needed? Alan Greenspan spoke to the difficulty of doing that today, and it does seem to me, and David Walker's been going around the country talking about this, one of our big challenges, and everyone I think recognizes that if not in the short term, certainly in the medium term, or the longer term, we've got to deal with this. It's not sustainable. How do we develop the national consensus, quite apart from the details, which I'll leave others to talk about? The key is to develop a national consensus to address this. This is going to be very difficult for the reasons Alan Greenspan spoke of, but unless we do this, develop the kind of national consensus we've had in the past, since the Revolution, up to the Vietnam War, we're going to find it very difficult to correct this, short of some very dire national set of circumstances.
Okay, thanks. David.
Well, before I answer the question, Clive, I want to thank you for reminding me of those good old days in the White House Budget Office and recommending my book, which was published in 1986. It has been out of print for 20 years. But in any event,
We'll come back in.
in any event, during
really
that period,
is it really out of print?
no,
I don't think it is.
no, during that,
Amazon has it.
With a new forward by Clark.
all right, maybe I'll answer the question. But no, what I was going to say is obviously this was the real pioneering effort to cut the budget that we did in the early Reagan years. I didn't win any popularity contest doing that, that's for sure. Some people think I was run out of town on a rail in 1985, and I probably was. But in any event, when I wrote the book, my publisher reserved 800 copies for me to distribute to my friends, all my friends. Well, I still have 790 copies left, so if any of you would like a copy of it, even though it's out of print, you can still get it. Now, my answer to the question is, there's something unique that's gone on since 1980. In a big picture sense, we have gone through a top-to-bottom referendum on fiscal policy and the budget for the last 30 years. It was kicked off by the first Reagan budget in 1981, and that created a lot of sparks and conflict. But it was the first effort to try to assess the modern welfare state as it emerged in the United States over 40 years of hit and miss and ad hocery from the New Deal, and then in the 1960s with the Great Society, and then Nixon larded it on quite healthily as well. So for the first time, we started a debate in 1981 about what do we want out of government, what kind of programs, social insurance, farm subsidies, aid to education, support for the cities, what kind of safety net, on and on. And what I would say is, after 30 years, we pretty much know the answer. And even though I don't like the answer, I'm a small government libertarian, I don't believe in half of this stuff, but the answer after 30 years can't be argued with, and sooner or later a democracy has to deal with its fiscal facts. And the facts are, after 30 years, the Republicans decided they wanted to cut nothing, despite all the rhetoric you hear in campaign after campaign. They didn't want to cut Social Security. It was the third rail of politics. They'd be electrocuted. They didn't really want to do anything about Medicare. Farm subsidies are, you know, an atrocious relic of the past. They actually larded up the farm subsidies. You could go on and on. Aid to higher education has doubled or tripled, whether you like it or not. The Republicans were behind it as much as the Democrats. So finally, we get to the last gasp, which is the Bush administration. And the one area that the Republicans always said during that 30-year period after they gave up one item after another that really makes a difference in the budget is non-defense discretionary spending. Now that was 12%, a little 12% corner of this massive welfare state budget that they'd more or less signed up on. But they said at least there it is loaded with waste, fraud, and abuse and bad programs and things government shouldn't be doing, and so that's where we're going to cut it. Well, in 2000, when Bush took office, non-defense discretionary spending was $260 billion. Bush had the veto pen, and the only place the veto pen works is on appropriations. It doesn't work on entitlements, they're automatic. When he left in 2008, non-defense discretionary spending was $420 billion, not $260. It had grown by 60%, 6.5% a year. He didn't veto one bill, and the Republicans in Congress went along with it, hook, line, and sinker. So we come to 2009, and I say the Republicans are out of business, they're not credible, and it's time for them to put down the bloody shirt and stop screaming about taxes, because the only way we're going to pay for this welfare state that we've had a political debate on and a referendum, rolling referendum for 30 years is by raising taxes and quite substantially before this country goes insolvent. And the way to start that, and then I'll shut up, is there's one easy thing to do, because I think the gap is $2 trillion. I think objectively we have debt 100% of GDP if you measure it carefully. We're in the Greek position already, it's just the market hasn't focused on it yet. But the one thing we can do this year and the here and now is to let the Bush tax cuts expire. It'll generate $300 billion of revenue. It'll come from the top half of the population that can afford it. And it is the right thing to do because we didn't earn them and we couldn't afford them in the first place, and they never should have been enacted. If we start there and then go to means testing, entitlements, and a lot of other things, I think we can begin to ride herd on this problem. But I'm afraid the Republicans are going to get out the bloody shirt and yell and scream, and Obama, who has the greatest opportunity to tell the Congress, don't have a lame duck session after the election, stay home and let these tax cuts expire, which is what would happen. It takes 0 votes to let the tax cuts expire. I'm afraid they're going to come back and have a huge free-for-all, get a Christmas tree bill, and put all this junk back in place. So that is where the cutting edge, that is where, as Howard Baker used to say, Senator Howard Baker, the majority leader, that's the lick log where we're really going to find out whether we're addressing this issue or not, and we'll find out in the next 5 months.
As I walked in, a friend of mine was saying, Clive, you're going to have your work cut out in this panel because they all agree with each other. Oh, no, they don't. That's, we're going to have an interesting discussion in just a moment. But I wonder if I can encourage EJ and David just to answer that. The first question, you know, on are we framing the issue correctly? Is it as serious as people are saying? And how quickly should we address it? EJ, if I could just add this for you. I was a bit surprised to hear that Bob say he didn't think that there was a national consensus on the need to get the debt down.
On how to get the debt down.
Different. I was going to ask you what your take was on, you know, on public opinion on the issue, how you read public opinion on the issue.
Well, I should probably say at the outset, I may be the closest thing to a deficit dove on this panel. And actually, my very favorite approach to deficits was the Sam Rosenman solution. Some of you may be familiar with this. Sam Rosenman was a Roosevelt speechwriter. And Roosevelt had famously given a speech in Pittsburgh promising to balance the budget. And in 1936, as you all know, Roosevelt did not balance the budget. He started running big deficits. He was going back to Pittsburgh to give a speech, and he went to his friend, speechwriter Sam Rosenman, and said, "What do I do? I went to Pittsburgh, promised I would balance the budget." And Sam Rosenman looked at Roosevelt and said, "Deny you were ever in Pittsburgh." And I wish we could do it that way. Even a deficit, a relative dove like myself has to acknowledge a basic fact. Center on budget policy priorities. Under current policies, debt would grow from 53% of GDP in 2009 to 300% of GDP in 2050. That is a problem that we're going to have to solve. My own view is this is not a catastrophe. I actually believe we will get around to solving it, or at least bringing the numbers down. Short term, I think it's very important, and I salute David Walker, who is a real deficit hawk, for a piece he wrote suggesting we really need to separate the short term from the long term. Most of the current deficit is explained, almost all of it, is explained by the decline in revenues because of the recession, including the stimulus tax cuts. You may not know it, but taxes are as low as they've ever been in our country for decades right now. They're taking, I think, 14% of GDP at the moment. You know, I had to add on top of that the cost to the Iraq, Afghanistan wars. I pray I know Iran war. And the rest of the cost to the stimulus, which will disappear, the TARP, which will also disappear. This accounts for almost all of it over the next 10 years. So the sky is not falling. But we do have to deal with this long-term problem, and I think there are a lot of different ways to do it. And I think one of the biggest problems in this debate is when people disguise a policy agenda behind deficit reduction. There are many different paths to deficit reduction. We ought to debate them openly and figure it out, but we shouldn't use deficit reduction in order to carry out hidden agendas to completely gut entitlements as opposed to reforming them, or many other things. The last thing, therefore, because I think there is not a short-term problem, there's a long-term problem, we don't need to panic, and I think we do need right now short-term stimulus, extended unemployment aid, help to the states, where we're doing a very dumb thing. We're having states either raise taxes or throw people off payrolls at a moment when we are learning in the last 2 economic reports that we got a real problem in getting job growth going. And if we get the economy moving quicker, we will begin to solve this problem quicker and then get to that second discussion.
David. We have a short-term deficit and a structural deficit. Most of the short-term deficit is due to temporary factors on the revenue side and the expenditure side. One can argue that we need to do more in the short term in order to help make sure that we don't have a double-dip recession and to get unemployment down. But the structural deficit threatens the future position of the United States and the future standard of living for our children and grandchildren. We have lost our way since the late 70s, early 80s. We've become addicted to conspicuous consumption, deficits, and debt. We are not exempt from the prudent laws of fundamental finance. Our total debt to GDP, public debt to GDP, federal, state, local, which is what you have to do to compare it to European nations, is worse than Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and not as bad as Greece and Italy. But we're heading that way. We have more rope because we're 64% of the world's global reserve currency. We're a safe haven in troubled times, but we are not exempt from the laws of prudent finance. What do we need to do? We need to eliminate the trillions of dollars in loopholes in the statutory pay-go rules that currently exist, including for the push tax cuts. We should do it immediately. Secondly, we should reimpose discretionary spending caps that that come into effect once unemployment has hit a stated level. But we need to recognize that structural unemployment is going to be 2 to 3% higher than historically it's been, because this country is not managing based on leading indicators. It's managing based upon the past. So I hope we can get into more solutions because we need them.
Okay, thanks very much. We are going to discuss their alternative paths, as EJ suggests. I think that's what I want to turn to next. But I just have a point of clarification I want to put to David Stockman, because I just want to make sure that I understood you correctly. When you say let the Bush tax cuts expire, you mean all of them, obviously, yes, not just the tax cuts for the rich.
Right.
Obama has promised there will be no tax increases for people on incomes families on incomes of less than $250,000. So you're urging him to, I don't know whether you call it breaking that promise, if you just stood by and let those taxes expire, or what. But that is a political problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm encouraging him to do what the first George Bush did, move his lips.
Remember what happened to the first George Bush?
Well, it may be, all right. But the point is that the cost of that on a long run, like 3 years out basis, is $300 billion. $100 billion of it is to the top, above 250,000. And the next 200 billion is for those who are in the income tax payment system below that, but most people under 50 to 75,000 don't pay income taxes anyway. So that's why I'm saying that. But I want to make one other point, and that is there's a lot more to do besides not extend the tax cuts. But if we extend the tax cuts, we're finished, because it'll put us right back into the paralysis that we've been in for 30 years. Nothing will be done. And I'm sorry, I have to revert to my great mentor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who once said that policy advocates like me and you, EJ, are entitled to our own opinion, but we're not entitled to our own facts. And I have to say, your facts about the structural deficit are wrong. The structural deficit is huge. It's $1 trillion if you look out 3 or 4 years from now with not a dime of TARP, not a dime of stimulus. That's what's built into the revenue base of current law, including extending the Bush tax cuts, and the spending base. And that's assuming 5 years out, 2015, that we create 12 million new jobs in the next 5 years, which I don't think has a remote chance of happening, and that GDP grows at 6% a year in nominal terms, when I think we're in a deflation and it's not even growing at all. So if you adjust for that, the real deficit without TARP, without stimulus, without all the short-term stuff you're talking about, is $2 trillion a year. That is a problem. That is built into the cake. It's in the pipeline. And as the market begins to realize that we're doing nothing about it, the assessment of the creditworthiness of the United States is going to change dramatically over time. The problem is you don't know when. You know it will happen, but you don't know when, just like the Greeks didn't know, the Spaniards didn't know, the EU didn't know, and unfortunately, when the world market reacts against the dollar bond, treasury bonds, of which there'll be 20 trillion outstanding in a few years, it ain't going to be anything like a 4-week dip in the stock market like we had on Greece. It's going to be a conflagration, and we need to face that before we drift much farther.
Can I cut you off?
I want to just ask
we'll come back to you, okay? I wanted to
point of personal privilege.
I wanted to acknowledge that I don't know if you other guys noticed, but Grover was the only one who actually answered my initial question very crisply and very briefly, and then we moved on to longer, more discursive and very interesting answers from the other. So I wanted to give Grover a chance to come back and respond to what David is saying about the way to do this is tax increases. You know, the spending cuts should not be in the picture. It's got to be tax increases.
Two things. One, I passed out on the blue sheet the list of the tax increases coming January 1 if nothing happens, so you can decide how you think they'll affect the economy. David Stockman made the case we've had this 30-year discussion on spending, and I've been involved in politics for 30 years, and I can tell you that I wish we'd had a conversation, a national debate on spending for 30 years. There are people inside Washington, D.C. having this conversation, but when you looked around to House and Senate candidates and governor candidates, what you got were discussions about taxes and, back in the 80s, inflation, abortion, gun control, a whole bunch of issues. What you didn't have is a voting bloc in this country that voted on spending. And what's actually changed dramatically, and I'm actually reasonably optimistic because the community organizer in the White House has organized a community that has never been organized before, and those are people who are reacting very strongly and negatively to too much spending. The $1 trillion in discretionary spending that they added in, the $800 billion on stimulus and so on, shocked people. Look at the Tea Party movement that people talk about. It didn't come as a result of tax increases. The same people who voted for Obama and the Democratic Congress, because they were reacting negatively to George Bush spending the previous 5 years being mayor of Baghdad rather than president of the United States, and deciding that an endless war overseas and occupation may not be where they wanted to go. The Republicans didn't leave. The independents went, psh, we're out of here. And they elected this Congress, this president, House and Senate, who then turned around, spent a great deal of money, tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan, and left the Iraq policy at the status quo. And all of a sudden, the guys in the middle, the independents, shifted heavily. New polls out by Carville that he picks up the same thing. The independent, non-aligned voters are voting against spending and are going to elect a very different House of Representatives and a somewhat different Senate as a result. But those votes are not cast because people disagree with Obama's foreign policy or abortion or gay marriage or something. Those Tea Party activists out there who I've worked with and chatted with, and the polling data shows the same thing, they're reacting to spending. They don't like the spending. They don't want tax increases. They want less spending. We've had a series of elections since then, the New Jersey governorship, the Virginia governorship. My home state of Massachusetts elected a senator who ran on the basis, I oppose expanding spending on government-run health care, and he carried the state of Massachusetts, and he carried independents very, very strongly. So with the success of New Jersey's governor, staring down the teachers' union, cutting spending 8% year over year, not $10 billion from what they wanted to spend, but 8% down year over year, we actually have a chance in this country to focus on the spending, and we are having a conversation, not in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., the Business Roundtable went to the White House a couple weeks ago and were told there will be no spending cuts. It's all going to be tax increases. It's all coming out of your hide, so design the tax increases you want on international businesses, which is why you see the Business Roundtable CEOs going nuts now, not 5 weeks ago, not 6 months ago, not a year ago, but now. They just got told, we're not doing spending restraint, we're only doing tax increases on you. I would argue that we actually, for the first time in this country's recent history, have a voting bloc that is voting against spending, and that this Congress and this Senate and the governors that are about to be elected this year will know they're elected to oppose new spending and to reduce spending. And if you look at the states and where we've got House races and state legislative races that will be determining redistricting for the next decade, this election, an anti-spending election, is going to create a different Congress, House, state legislators for the next decade. Not for one election, but for the next decade. So this is a very, very interesting race. If New Jersey hadn't succeeded, maybe it would have been different. If somehow the administration had culled back and said we're going to spend less and not spend so much, that might have been different. But they're going full bore ahead on spend more. And that's why the politics of this have changed. The House, the polling data, unless something dramatic changes, the Republicans will take the House. Not with your old Republicans, not with the Republicans you used to deal with. We've been knocking off guys like Bennett, appropriators, and other appropriators. And because, as you know the joke in D.C., there are three parties, Republican Party, Democrat Party, and the appropriators. And Republican appropriators, you know, may wear the R jersey, but they aren't, and that's what you ran into regularly. The ones that haven't been beat have been scared. They've been standing next to guys who got beat. So there will be, after this next election, more and better Republicans, as opposed to the old Stalin joke, because they're going to get elected, but they're also scared straight on what people want. There was never a voting bloc against spending that was visible before. It may have been there quietly, but not visible, and it's there now.
But isn't the problem that you know, people are in favor of cutting government spending in the abstract, in general, in principle, but when you get to specific programs, the support just dissolves. It gets very, very difficult.
We had a test of that in Massachusetts.
Let me bring David.
That wasn't detailed enough, Grover. The bottom line is people are concerned with spending. The problem is primarily a spending problem. There's no question about that. When we deal with the structural deficit, the solutions are going to be primarily renegotiating the social insurance contract while providing a solvent, sustainable, secure social safety net. It's going to be cutting defense spending and other spending and reprioritizing, but it's going to be more revenues. There's going to be more revenues because there's a new four-letter word in Washington. It's called math. Now, the answer to your question is
what?
Math, M-A-T-H. All right? And so the fact is...
So you're saying we need both?
Hold on. We need both, but there's an honest debate about how much of each and how best and when to do it, but we got to do it. All right? Now, here's the key. What do the people think? They know that we're on an improved and unsustainable path. They want something done about it. We just, the Peterson Foundation, funded, along with the MacArthur Foundation and Kellogg, the first ever representative citizen engagement effort, 19 cities around the United States, 2 weekends ago, and asked them to try to deal with the structural deficit in 2025. And basically what they said was, everything's got to be on the table. We have to renegotiate social insurance contracts. We need to cut defense and other spending, and we're going to have to generate some more revenues. All right? We need to do something soon before we lose confidence of our foreign lenders and potentially pass a tipping point where interest rates end up rising rapidly, because the bottom line is, without an increase in interest rates, the number one line item in the federal budget in 12 years is interest on the federal debt. And what do you get for it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that's without an increase in interest rates. And I'm telling you, once we get past our current situation, they will go up. And the only question is how high.
I want to bring EJ back in because I cut him off earlier.
First of all, I want to invite Grover to tell us what spending he wants to cut. If we can get to a balanced budget with only spending cuts, I want to know what you'd cut. Second point, just in response to David Stockman, I couldn't tell, you might not like the fact that I'm more at ease about this than you are. David is one of the sort of the happiest, most gloomy guys I know. And it is a wonderful, I heard him give a 1.5-hour presentation, and it was so cheerful, and the underlying gloom, you know, you almost missed the gloom. But, you know, I said that I think that, you know, the debt will grow from 53% of GDP to 300% in 40 years. 300% is too high. We're going to have to do something about that. I don't quibble with that. David Walker mentioned the 1970s and 1980s. He didn't mention the 1990s. It is worth remembering that we balanced the budget in the 1990s, that there was a balance, there was a surplus in 2001. The country then proceeded to cut tax, the government in Washington proceeded to start 2 wars and cut taxes twice. If you want a deficit, start 2 wars and cut taxes twice. And I just think that is a small fact that should be on the table. Rising healthcare costs are the single biggest cause of this problem. I don't think David disagrees with that. I agree with that. And that, you know, just by the way, the CBO came out with a study this week that said the healthcare bill just passed, if fully implemented, would cut the deficit by $100 billion over the next decade, but by $1 trillion, which is 0.5% of GDP in the decade after that. Now, you can believe that or you cannot believe that, but that's what the CBO, which is not a notoriously partisan group, a partisan organization, in fact, its numbers are reliable, put out. So if we're going to talk about spending, let's talk about what we're going to cut. If we do not get healthcare costs under control, and that's a really difficult and complicated thing, as we saw from the healthcare fight. Every attempt, one of the reasons this bill was so hard to pass, there were many, but one of them was that any threat to cut something out, creating a commission to cut Medicare in the future, or any kind of tax on insurance plans, all of that was very difficult to pass. But we've got to get healthcare costs under control. If we did that, this problem would be substantially more manageable. And I think you agree with that too. Social Security is actually a very small piece of this problem.
Medicare was underfunded $38 trillion before the health care bill passed. CBO has said in all kinds of footnotes that they have serious concerns about the reasonableness and sustainability of the assumptions underlying this bill. If you believe that this bill is going to save us money, I've got a bridge that I'd like to sell you, okay?
Yeah. Well, so what do you say
hold
back
on,
to the
but
CBO?
EJ, because CBO, look, I was Comptroller General tonight. CBO is required by law to score things certain ways. They are required by law to assume that if Congress says that they're going to constrain spending by X, if they say that they're going to tax something by Y, that it will happen. When there's clear and compelling evidence that it is not. Now, don't get me wrong. There's some good things in the bill. There's some good, the IPAB has hope. Don't get me wrong. Here's the bottom line. Let's take four presidents. Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama. 3 litmus tests on fiscal responsibility. Do you break campaign promises when you find out that it's clearly irresponsible, the promise you made? Number 2, do you oppose tough statutory budget controls to constrain spending? Because you've got to have a basis to do that. And number 3, do you not expand entitlement promises, which is the most irresponsible thing you can do? The answer is, for Bush 41 and Clinton, they all get an A, 3 for 3. For Bush 43, and so far for this president, it's an F. It's 0 for 3. The difference is President Obama has a chance to turn things around. And I hope that he does, because we need him to. And I think he's got the ability to, and I just hope that he does.
Can I add a word about President Obama?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, let me just follow up David's point. First of all, I think that the president, from the various occasions I've seen him discuss this, not just formally but informally, this is something he is focused on a great deal. This is something, and I think he understands the structural issues that we've been talking about quite clearly. If you look at the kind of things he's talked about, the setting up this commission, which actually people in some cases dismiss commissions, the Greenspan Commission actually was quite effective. If this commission can do what the president has asked, which is to say to reduce the deficit substantially and stabilize our debt at 70% of GDP by 2015, that will be a very substantial contribution to turning things around. The big question is, can he get, if this commission does agree, you need 14 out of 18 to do it, then can you get the political support? But the fact is, if you can get a fairly bipartisan group in the commission, you can actually, as we do with the Base Closing Commission and the Greenspan Commission, make a considerable amount of progress. Second, restoring PAYGO. Now, there are those who think PAYGO was not terribly successful. It was better than any of the various methods we've had in the past for exerting some discipline on the process. So I think that the final story is not written. I think there is an understanding, first of all, that there is a need to put our debt on a sustainable basis. And let me just make 2 quick points. One, even if there is not a crisis, the point that David made is, David Walker made a moment ago, is very important. And that is, even if there's no crisis, we're going to be adding to the interest payments on the federal debt, which means that it will exceed defense spending in a few short years. And that money will not only be a negative in terms of the domestic economy, a lot of it's going to be transferred abroad, because a large portion of the debt now, the incremental debt, is being held by foreigners. So we're not only using money for a non-productive purpose, which is to say paying the interest, which we have to do, but a lot of it is going to be transfer payments abroad. And I think there's an understanding, certainly on the part of the president, and certainly the advisors around him, that for these various reasons, A, to avoid a crisis, but B, to avoid this deterioration in our overall budgetary circumstances, this is something that has to be dealt with. So I'm concerned. I think it is a huge problem and an unsustainable outlook. But I'm also of the view that there are plenty of people in the administration who are aware of this. And the question is, can you get the domestic political support and the domestic political consensus to do it? And what will be when you do it, and what will be the trade-off between tax increases and spending cuts?
Yeah, Grover, you wanted to come back, but I'm going to give you a chance to do that right now. But and then you, David. But I just wanted to encourage you to respond to EJ's challenge. You know, what precisely would you cut in order to get a grip on this problem?
Two things. One, I passed out my testimony before the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility, which deals with just that question. But two, I always get a kick out of people who advocate more government spending who say, well, what would you cut on spending? But when they raise taxes, they never go to the American people and give them a list of things that they'll be cutting their spending on. When the government raises taxes and they think people are undertaxed, they should really give us a list of things that we shouldn't have anymore. And they tend not to do that because it gets in the way of a tax increase. But I do commend the piece that I wrote and shared with the tables.
For those of us who haven't had time to read it, just give us the headline.
3 items you've got.
Well, there are two things. This is, first of all, I'd have started with not doing $800 billion on a stimulus package, which has left us with more unemployment than not. The side that came up with government taking over health care because this will reduce the cost of health care, right? Government running the health care system, paying for it, is going to reduce the cost of health care. Really? $800 billion on spending, $350 billion on bailouts, and so on. That is not a serious effort. Let's not do those things, and let's stop that part of those things that have not gone on. What we do have to do is get a consensus. This is what I was talking about earlier. What I want to speak to is David Walker's comments. Here are 4 presidents and how they did things. Presidents are fine, okay? However, but Obama has almost nothing to do with the present crisis. If the present spending that's being put together, the new government programs, were a martini, Obama's the vermouth. The Democrats in the House and Senate put all of these packages together. They're the gin. They're almost all of it. And maybe people around the president would like to do something about spending. It's not their call. Ronald Reagan would have liked to have done something about spending. It wasn't his call. Watch Congress. I'll put a stack of things in the back. I thought it was too aggressive to make the list. But I track not presidents and the unemployment rate, or presidents and how the stock market does, but control of Congress with how those two things flow. Watch Congress. That's what matters. Presidents are nice. They get to sign the bills. Congress matters on spending. Congress matters on tax policy. The administration can do silly things on regulatory.
Veto bills.
Okay,
Presidents do not get to veto bills when you stick everything together. They tend not to veto them.
EJ's vibrating. We've got to.
Well, I am. Well, first of all, I'm vibrating for 2 reasons. The notion that governments can't provide health care at lower cost. France, Britain, Australia, Switzerland, the Netherlands. I can go through a very long list of countries where the government plays a far larger role, and their share of GDP that goes to healthcare is much lower than ours. Our government system under Medicare spends, it's as a percentage of GDP, is almost equal to the entire system in France, which covers everybody. So now you may not like government healthcare, and you can argue about that, but it is not an absurd thing. On the contrary, the evidence points the other way.
I should have
that
said,
a government role.
I should have said, without reducing care and without rationing, you can't do it.
Well, there's not rationing, but I want to hear
no
a spending cut.
here?
I want to hear where you're going to solve this problem.
Well, let me suggest one, and see how all of you guys respond to this. Raise the retirement age, and make inroads on Social Security spending and Medicare spending at one and the same time. Bob mentioned the Greenspan Commission. That was how the Greenspan Commission did its fix of Social Security, by raising the retirement age.
They didn't recommend to raise the retirement age. That was done on the floor of the House by J.J. Pickle.
That's not right.
No, that's not.
That's not right.
Well, look, let's
But I think
Listen,
I was there. Okay.
let's not get bogged down in
No,
that.
but there's
how
actually-
about
The
that
great pickle
proposal?
debate.
Let's raise the retirement age. What do each of you think of that?
Okay, I would like to address that because, in fact, the retirement age was raised in 1982 after the Greenspan Commission. I was involved in negotiating, and Alan was, he's here somewhere, all the details. And when we got down to the very end, push came to shove. We still hadn't created solvency out over 30 years. Senator, so-called Senator Pepper, Claude Pepper from Florida, a great champion of Social Security and advocate, and was on the commission. He had the final vote. He spoke for the retirees of America. And we said to Senator Pepper, who was 88 at the time, would you like to have a reform of early retirement right now, or raise the retirement age in steps beginning in 2008? Now, this was 1982. He said, I'll go for the 208, okay? So my point is, we did raise it between 208 and 222, okay, from 65 to 65 to 68. But the problem is we don't have the luxury of another 30-year phase-in in warning because of how far we've drifted with this massive national debt that's been accumulated in the interim. So therefore, we have to we have to basically renege on the social contract with Social Security recipients and Medicare recipients now.
Well,
and we have to make it effective.
Yeah.
Okay, and
Well,
how would I do it? There's a 1.4 trillion out 4 years, 800 billion of Social Security, 500 billion of Medicare, a couple $100 billion more of civil service retirement and veterans and so forth. And we need to tell the top 1/3 of that retired population that they're going to be means tested, and the 700 billion that goes to the top 1/3 is going to be cut by 30%, and that will save $200 billion. That will be painful. That will be traumatic. But that's what we need to do by revising the social contract, but it'll only get us $200 billion, and we need to save $1 trillion. And that's why I'm talking about taxes.
But every $200 billion helps.
It helps.
There's a specific spending of proposal, Grover. What do you make of that idea? Are you for that?
I was certainly for the original one and would have gone, suggested starting earlier. We have at the Willie Brown today in New York, in California, pointed out pensions in California have gone up 2,400% when spending went up 24%. And the same day, our friends in San Francisco announced they spend $1.2 billion on pensions, which is 28 times what they spend on repairing and constructing roads in the city. So there is and these are from leading Democrats, obviously, the recognition that the teachers' unions have gotten out of control, that tenure needs to be reformed, that we ought not to pay for rubber rooms. At the federal level, I'm not quite sure how this happened, but polling now shows that people understand that government employees actually get paid more than they do, have bigger pensions, and more health care benefits. I don't know how this dawned on people, but when you look at the numbers at the federal level, federal employees make twice on average what private sector employees do, but if you adjust for education levels, it's 40%. Okay, it's a 40% premium. $47 billion we pay federal employees, and only 3 million of them. You go to state and local employees, there's a lot more overpayment going on, particularly with the pensions and the health care benefits. The recognition by the voters that this is happening, the fight they just had in New Jersey, I don't think should be minimized. New Jersey is a blue state. I don't think, maybe New York has a higher level of unionization.
Just want to understand, I mean, perhaps I'm being a little slow here, and far be it from me to accuse you of evading the question. But let me just put it back to you one more time. Are you in favor of means testing Social Security?
I mean, it's an option. We need to do something along those lines. I don't have a vote on it, and two, you don't want to get ahead of where voters are. You want to work with voters to make sure they understand what you're doing. Okay. And so I haven't looked at the numbers on that, but that direction that you're talking about is a sound one. It's one that's been moved in the past. But I do think that this idea that people sitting in D.C. coming up with how to balance the budget without getting buy-in from the American people is a mistake.
I hear you. But before I go back to David, EJ, are you in favor of means testing Social Security?
Well, first of all, I am against, I may be the only person here other than Grover who, I guess the teachers' unions have something to do with the Social Security problem. I'm against raising the Social Security retirement age beyond 68. I mean, I hope that I can still do what I do when I'm over 68. I talk and I write. There are a lot of people in this country who don't do work, who do very hard physical labor, and I just don't see how we can just keep trying to save this program by jacking up the retirement age
life
beyond...
expectancy keeps going up and up and up, and fewer people are actually engaged in, you know, in mining and other back-breaking labor. Most of us work in offices these days.
Yes, but I still think that the retirement age beyond 68, I think that we are going to have to figure out, I mean, let me back up. I never understand why we go first to Social Security in this, because Social Security is a very small part of this long-term problem. But since you have gone there first, I do think we're going to have to put more money into Social Security. You can raise the ceiling on the taxes, and there probably will have to be some modest cuts in benefits. I think this problem can be solved with some increase in taxes and some reductions in benefits. And
but you're
when
not
you say
gonna
means testing, I was in favor of and remain in favor of tossing Social Security, taxing the entire amount of Social Security for well-off people, which is in effect means testing. In other words, I just think that Social Security income for people above a certain amount should be regarded as part of their income, and they should be taxed on it. And so, is that means testing or not? I don't know, but I think that's the way to do it. They're up to 85%. I'd go all the way.
They already are, but anyway, David, yeah.
Why don't we do a specific, okay? The reason you do Social Security first is not because it's the biggest problem, but it's the most solvable problem. There has basically been a consensus since 1999 about a framework for Social Security reform. And personally, I think it would have happened during the Clinton administration, but for the blue dress incident, but we won't go there right now, okay? The fact of the matter is, we need to strengthen the benefit for people near the poverty level, because too many people rely solely on Social Security. It wasn't intended to be that way, but it is, 22%. Over 50% of Americans rely on it for their sole form of retirement income. We need to reduce the relative replacement rate for middle and upper income. We need to look at the indexing for the COLA benefit to better reflect true inflation for people who are seniors, which the current one does not. We need to consider raising the taxable wage-based cap, but not eliminating the taxable wage-based cap. We need to also gradually increase the normal and the early retirement age over time to recognize longer life expectancy. We need to have an out for certain occupations through the disability program, which is a small part of the population. And we need to add on top of a solvent, sustainable, secure, defined benefit program, an automatic savings account, 2 to 3% of pay, payroll deduction, real trust fund, real investments, real fiduciary responsibility and liabilities, gives you a pre-retirement death benefit, a supplemental retirement benefit, helps increase our savings rate. You get win-win-win. Every generation gets more than they think they're going to get. Not more than they're promised, more than they think they're going to get. I call that a win. Let's get some points on the board and let's do it next year.
Okay. One last, I just looked at my watch. We're almost out of time. I can't believe it. An hour's gone by already. But I just wanted to ask like a closing question, maybe get a brief response from each of you on it. Bob's already touched on this. And this is the issue of the bipartisan fiscal commission. I plead guilty to being one of those who regards it as a stalling device that isn't going to achieve anything. You've already said, Bob, you think it's a really hopeful and important thing. I'm not asking you to restate that position. I would just want to hear what the others very briefly feel. I mean, might this do the trick, or are we just sort of spinning our wheels for the next 6 months and avoiding discussing the issue? Grover.
It's worse than that. Look, the Democrats have 59 votes in the Senate, a strong majority in the House, and a president. They wanted to cut anything, they could do it tomorrow. They've decided to set up a commission, and the commission comes out before the election so the American people could look at the ideas and talk about what they like. No, it comes out after the election. And it gives everybody who's been spending the country blind a one-paragraph talking. I care so much about spending. I'm for this imaginary commission that's going to come up with some unicorn idea. And I'm for the billions and trillions that it will save, but I don't know what they are because it's a secret. It's designed to allow people to lie their way past the election. That's what it was set up for. And one of two things happens. The Republicans take the House and the commission disappears, or the Democrats hold on to things and the commission recommends a VAT.
Okay, I'll take that as a negative. David, what's your view of it?
Well, I think they'll come up with a nice paper blueprint, but all the ideas that have been discussed here this afternoon are already known. So we don't need a study to find out what the choices are. The big choices are what we've talked about, what David's talked about. So the question is, once we get through the election, what will be the agenda of the lame duck Congress? And it's one thing and one thing only that will determine whether we go, off the deep end or whether we begin to dig out. Okay. And that is, do you let these Bush tax cuts expire? Okay. That's the decision. It's unfortunate. I'm for spending cuts. I'm for small government. But we're now 30 years past that. We've got to begin to pay our bills, and that's where we start. And if we don't start there, it'll never get done.
Okay. E.J., are you waiting with bated breath for the Commission's recommendations?
Well, I think the Commission could be useful if it only framed the choices we got to make between spending cuts and tax increases, and to make very clear that you can't get by with just generalized attacks on spending. You're either cutting something or you're not, and if you don't want to cut it, you've got to find revenue somewhere. David did mention that he is also for the Tobin tax. He's for a transaction tax where on supply side grounds, actually. Right. But I won't go into that. But
thank you for not going into that.
Yes, but there are many. There are many ways to get there. I mentioned. I won't read it, but Ezra Klein had a wonderful blog item where he went through the budget calculator of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and made a whole series of choices that were none of the conventional choices we're talking about. Got the deficit down to 60% of GDP, which is sort of where so I think there are many ways to do it. So do I think they're going to get to 14 votes? It'll depend if Republicans want to vote in favor of raising some tax. Probably it will be the VAT, which I am ambivalent about. I don't think it's not my first choice. But I'll close with the best line ever on the VAT, which it was from Larry Summers before he went to work for President Obama. He once said that we don't have a VAT because liberals don't like it because it's regressive, and conservatives don't like it because they worry it'll be a money machine for government. We will get a VAT when conservatives realize it's regressive and liberals realize it's a money machine for government.
You do know who he was quoting when he said that?
What?
Richard Nixon.
Oh,
that was Richard
right?
Nixon's thesis, yes.
Well,
David, I'm giving you the...
He wasn't wrong on everything.
Right,
this is the last
yes,
word.
He was.
We have to finish with
David.
David.
The answer is, when you look at who's on the commission, who has a vote, it's extremely difficult to see how they're going to get 14 out of 18 votes. But I do think that they can do productive work. They can come up with ideas that the president and others can use to advocate. I think it's imperative that we do several things. We must, no later than 2011, reimpose tough statutory budget controls. We must, in 2011, reform Social Security to make it solvent, sustainable, secure, and more savings-oriented so we can gain some confidence, enhance credibility, and we need to make sure that in 2012 that we have a referendum election that will cause us to do really tough stuff on health care cost control and comprehensive tax reform in 2013. That's the path forward. It's critically important
because the structural deficit threatens the entire future of this country and our families. And it's no longer long-term.
That's why the referendum's 2010, not 2012. It'll be 2010.
All right, Grover, you got the last word.
There will be something in 2010, but not the whole way.
We have to finish. Please join me in thanking the panel. I thought it was a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Enjoy it.
Well, so much for us all.